Look, some of you probably know a bit about me, some of you don't know, so just by the way, who's this guy standing in front of you? Just very briefly, I was born in Germany. My parents migrated in 61 when I was a little 8-year-old boy, so if you do your maths, I'm 70. But I worked as an agricultural scientist for about 6-7 years in Tasmania, then the call to ministry, studied, served as a pastor in the Christian Reformed churches for 25 years. And then I got very concerned about the undermining of Christian values in society. And some of you may know I've got a brother, Eric. He served as a Tasmanian senator from 1994, I think it was, to the last federal election. And I talked to him because some of the elders were suggesting that I should actually run for Parliament. I thought, no, I've changed career once already. I don't need another career change. I'm a bit too old to try something new. But he encouraged me because he said, you've got a science background and pastoral work. You've really got a good broad picture of life. And so he encouraged me. So cut a really long story short, I ran for the seat of Southern River in 2008 and managed to get elected. And served 2 terms in the state parliament, and then when that was over, they changed my boundaries, so it became a safe Labor seat, and I was a Liberal MP. That happens to MPs at times when they change the boundaries, and I thought, what's next? So anyway, I headed up the No campaign in the same-sex marriage plebiscite. And I must have done a reasonable job because the Australian Christian Lobby at the end of it said, would you be willing to take on the role of being the state director for Western Australia? And I thought, that's really a good fit, having been in politics and been a pastor kind of thing. I thought perhaps that's what God's calling me to do. And I love what I do. Although my dear wife says I should be slowing down at the age of 70, but I just tell people I haven't got time to get old, so that's okay. So that's just a little bit about me. And some of you may not be familiar with the Australian Christian Lobby, so I thought I'll just give a very short little commercial. Oops, hang on, I'm going too fast here. Hang on. Here we go. Australian Christian Lobby was set up by Jim Wallace in 2001. Jim Wallace was the commander of the SAS, a very strategic thinker, a very committed Christian guy, and he really felt, as I did, that we really need to do something about getting a Christian voice into the public square to try and influence the direction of society. And so the objective is to see Christian values and ethics influencing the way we're governed, do business and relate as a society. And we do that by informing, equipping and mobilising Christians to act. And also, for me, as the state director, directly lobby MPs. But our big focus the last couple of years has been actually to equip Christians to do the lobbying, because I'm just one voice, but if 20, 30 people go and see their local MP about an issue, the MP gets the message, hey, there's something going on in the community. Whereas, say, if I go, well, yeah, Christians, yeah, that's kind of what they expect. So that's part of our strategy. I'm getting ahead of myself. Yep. And at the moment, we've got about 25,000 supporters in WA. And I just want to tell you, as Christians, we often think we're this tiny little minority somewhere. Well, if you add up the total membership of the Liberal Party, the National Party and the Labor Party, we've actually got more supporters than those 3 political parties put together. So if every Christian gets our emails, actually just did a few things every year, we could have a massive impact. So, people think, I haven't got a lot of time, but if you just sign the petitions that we send out via email, or we say, hey, can you write a quick email to your MP? If you just do that 4 times in a year, that's 100,000 things going into the political space. So don't underestimate the importance of you actually doing something. As little as it may seem, don't underestimate the importance of that. Okay, that's the end of the commercial. If any of you are not getting the Australian Christian Lobby emails and would like to get them, there is a clipboard, I'm not sure exactly where it is, and a pen. If you'd like to put your details on there, I can put you on the email list. It's free, doesn't cost you anything. But if you'd like to just pass that around while I'm talking, that'd be great. Okay. What is it that actually shapes our society? And what I would put to you is that a society's core beliefs is actually what shapes it, because your core beliefs, they shape your values. And your values hopefully shape your actions. And the collective actions of a community is what shapes the culture. So if we're unhappy with what's happening in the culture, if we try and change the culture, that's not going to work very well. We've actually got to go back to square one and change people's core beliefs. And that's why it's so important for the church to be effective in passing the baton of faith to the next generation. Now, ACL, we can do lots of lobbying and all of that, but if the next generation doesn't share our core values, society's going to keep going in the wrong direction. So I just want to say that ACL on its own, we can't turn our society around. It actually requires the church to be instrumental in God's hand in passing the baton of faith to the next generation and evangelising those who yet don't know the gospel, because transformed lives tend to transform society. That's the reality. So just keep that in mind. And when we look back in history, and you might sort of think, where's all this going, Peter? I just want to give you a little history lesson, if you like, about how have we come to be where we are today in terms of the whole LGBTQ plus ideology. What's happened in our society? So I just want to walk you through that and give you a little bit of perspective. The laws that our society operates on, they're very much shaped by the morals or the core beliefs, as I've indicated, and Christian teaching has really shaped Western society. A lot of people kind of think, well, it's always been like this, but we need to keep in mind that, say, in the Roman world, in the Greek world, what we would consider as sort of normal sexual morality, that was totally foreign to the Roman and Greek world. The purest form of sex in Greek community, in Greek culture, was actually between an adult man and a boy. Now, that's perversion, but that's what they thought. In Roman society, you got married to a woman so you could have progeny, but it wasn't about loving your wife. So when the Apostle Paul said, your husbands love your wives, that was radical stuff in the Roman civilization, whereas we kind of think, well, of course you should love your wife. But that was radical. So we just need to realise that basically what happened was when the Roman Empire collapsed, the church was one of the very few institutions that actually survived the collapse of the Roman Empire. And because the priests and the monks, they were people who were educated, had capacity to write and so on, they became the de facto local governments, you could say. And so they basically shaped Western culture massively. And so they were both the spiritual and the civil authority. And so the Western world very much embraced and legislated biblical sexual values. And most people just don't understand just how profoundly Christian values have actually shaped our Western society. And I just want to quickly go over what is actually the biblical teaching about sexuality and all of that. Genesis 1, God said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. So it was God's intent that there be male and female. And it was not good for man to be alone. I'll make a helper suitable for him. It teaches us the complementarity of the sexes, that it's not, the idea that gender is a social construct is a total nonsense. It's the Bible's very clear as to that. And after naming the animals, it says there was no suitable helper found for Adam, and he now finds wholeness in his marriage to Eve. And so the male-female complementarity, marriage, one man, one woman, is very much the teaching of Scripture. And not only is it the teaching of Scripture, but nature actually points to it, because male and female are born roughly in equal numbers. So the idea that gender is binary is actually nothing radical. There is male, there is female, and it's as simple as that. Okay, that's how God created things, but the problem was the fall came in. The fall into sin, and that led to all sorts of problems, and sin impacted also all areas of life, including sexuality and relationships, and also the genetics was impacted. that you've got things like deleterious mutations, dwarfism, Down syndrome, and that type of thing. But the normal thing is that all of us have got XX or XY chromosomes. There is every cell in your body. If you're female, it screams XX. If you're a male, it screams XY. You can't change that biological reality. And the reality is that between male and female, there are actually something like over 10,000 biological differences between male and female. My daughter's a pharmacist, and she actually tells me that some medications you need to know whether it's a male or a female, because the dosage rate has to be different because of the way your body handles that particular medicine. So, there is massive differences biologically between male and female, and to claim that it's purely a social construct, it flies in the face of reality. Now, because of the fall into sin, things have gone wrong. We've got domestic violence instead of partnership. We've got divorce instead of lifelong marriage. And also sometimes same-sex attraction instead of the male-female being complementary. So, we need to face the fact that we live in a fallen world. And the Bible's very clear, Leviticus 18:22, do not lie with a man as one lies with a woman, that is detestable. You can't get much clearer than that. Leviticus 20 basically says the same thing, it even gives the death penalty for that. And in the Western world, that was actually, up until about the early 1900s, most Western countries actually had the death penalty for people caught doing same-sex acts. And the New Testament as well. Okay. Interesting that in Corinthians, the Apostle Paul writing there, but the important thing to remember is it includes the men who practice homosexuality, but let's not put that as some super sin, but the greedy, the drunkards, the revilers, the swindlers, hey, they won't inherit the kingdom either. So let's keep things in perspective and just recognise it's only the blood of Christ that can actually bring forgiveness and restore people to wholeness. Also, the whole issue of cross-dressing or the trans thing. In Deuteronomy, a woman shall not wear a man's garment, nor shall a man put on a woman's cloak. Whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord your God. So the Christian core beliefs on sexuality and gender is that God made us male and female, and we are to embrace who God has made us to be. We live in a fallen world, and sometimes people struggle with, hey, I'd rather be a boy, I'd rather be a girl. Hey, those things, that's part of the fallenness. But as God's people, our task is to embrace who God has made us to be, and anybody who's struggling with those things, to actually help them to embrace who God has made them to be, rather than to say, hey, it's okay to be what you would like to be.
Can you give us that other scripture from Leviticus, that one back? Deuteronomy.
Oops. Which one? Oh, that one, Deuteronomy 22, verse 5, yeah. But if any of you want the PowerPoint, I'm more than happy to email it to you if you put your email address on the clipboard. Yep. No worries.
This is being recorded, by the way, if you want a link.
Yep. Great. Okay. And basically, Scripture's teaching is that sexual relationships should only take place in the context of heterosexual marriage. And again, for the ancient world, that was radical thought. That was totally foreign concept in the Roman and the Greek world. But because of the collapse of the Roman Empire and the influence of the church becoming the civil authority, it kind of it shaped Western culture. And I've talked about that already. Okay. Up until 1899, engaging in sodomy was a criminal death penalty offence. And interesting too is the DSM. Now that's the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, which is sort of like the diagnostic Bible, if you like, for psychiatrists. And every 10 years or so, 15 years, they put out an updated edition for mental health conditions and all that. And if you look at the DSM from 1952, it actually talks about homosexuality as a sociopathic personality disturbance. In 1968, it's still talked about as a sexual deviation. And in Western society, till not that long ago, actually committing adultery was actually a criminal offence. Most of us have perhaps forgotten that, but that was part of the law in Australia as well. And our Western laws also embraced the biblical law regarding that sexual relationships between close relatives are not acceptable. But things began to change in the 1960s. The sexual revolution of the 1960s, free love and all of the hippie stuff, some of you are old enough to remember that. But with the advent of the pill, the risk of becoming pregnant became significantly less. And so there was this throwing off of traditional morality. In 1969, you had the Stonewall riots, which was where police, they raided a gay bar in New York. And the result was that, they had the people rioted and one thing and the other. And then in the 1970s in Australia and in much of the Western world, there's a growing push to decriminalise homosexual acts. People were saying, well, hang on a minute, what two blokes do in their bedroom on their own, in the privacy of that's nobody's business. And most of the people thought, well, I suppose that's fair enough. And so homosexuality over time was decriminalised. But the gay activists, they were still really upset about the fact that in the DSM, the psychiatrist's Bible, if you like, it was still considered a pathology. And so what they did was they kept invading psychiatrists' conferences and causing disruption. And so in 1973, the psychiatrists took the decision that homosexuality was no longer any kind of disorder. There was no scientific paper presented to or evidence base for it. It was just simply a political decision that they made. And in the 1960s, you also had a growing influence of what's called cultural Marxism. Now, I'm not sure whether you're familiar with cultural Marxism. I do a whole 2-hour presentation on that if you give me a chance, but I won't do that now. But basically, you probably know a bit about Karl Marx. He said the workers would rise up against the bosses and overthrow the order of Western society. Well, some of the Marxists, they said, well, that's actually not happening. And basically what they said was, there's a guy, Herbert Marcuse, it's called the Frankfurt School of Marxism. They basically said, no, Marx got this wrong. What we need to do is we actually need to put Marxists into key positions in society, particularly into teacher education, so that we train teachers to think the way we want them to think. They will teach the next generation. Within 2 generations, we've got everybody thinking the way that we want them to think. And they actually coined the phrase, we need to march through the institutions. And the cultural Marxists gained significant ground during the 60s, and I think it's fair to say that they pretty much captured the academic world in terms of, if you don't espouse sort of the cultural Marxist view of the world, which divides everybody into oppressors or the oppressed, you're going to find going pretty difficult as an academic in most universities. Oops, why is that not moving?
That might be me, sorry. Try again now.
Aha, thank you. Okay, behind the scenes, while all this was happening, there was also a guy, Paul Rondeau. I won't talk much about that because James is going to talk about that, but he basically was engaged by the gay activists, and he said, what we have to do is to get homosexuality accepted in society. We've got to desensitise people, so just keep blasting it out and jamming in the sense of you just can't escape it, and people get initially they get annoyed about it, but they'll get so used to it that in the end they'll just acquiesce and accept it. And just about every soap has got to have a gay couple in it these days. Whether it's a police movie or whatever, you've got to have the obligatory gay or lesbian or trans person in it. And what the cultural Marxists have been very good at doing too is rewriting our history. The history that our kids learn at high school is actually a rewritten version of history according to the Marxist view of the world. If you go to university these days, you will be taught how evil the missionaries were because they destroyed Aboriginal culture, etc., etc. I used to go to Warburton, the remote Aboriginal community, for nearly 20 years with teams from our church and doing holiday programs for them, the kids up there. And the old Aboriginals who remembered the mission days, they talk about the mission days as the golden era of Warburton. because the missionaries genuinely cared about them. You know, the old Aboriginal people, they learned to read and write. Those missionaries up at Warburton, they weren't even qualified teachers, but they managed to teach the kids to read and write. Now we send university qualified teachers there and they can't make it happen. Why? Because, hey, the missionaries, they learnt the local language. So if the kids were talking behind their back, they knew what they were saying. And they were able to engage with the community. They knew they were genuinely concerned for their well-being and made a difference. But, hey, missionaries are all evil these days if you study history. The Silicon Valley, so the whole Facebook and social media world, are really promoting transhumanism, which is a fancy way of saying that our human identity is entirely up to us to create. So in other words, we are the masters of our own destiny. Our biology is actually irrelevant. We can simply construct ourselves to be who we want to be. And you kind of think, well, how does all this happen? This is, you've all heard of the Safe Schools program, no doubt. That came out of La Trobe University. And, let's jump forward. Have a look at this, 1982. Professor Gary Dowsett at La Trobe University, he wrote in this publication, first we have 3 legal social questions to win: custody rights for gay men and lesbian, the legal rights of pedophiles and their young loves. Did you hear that? And finally, the sexual rights of children as a whole. Now, my wife and I, we had 5 children, and I object to anybody claiming that young children are sexual beings. Sure, they're male or female, but the idea of sex is foreign to a child's mind. That I might have been very slow, but I didn't really get interested in girls and that kind of thing until I hit high school. But the idea that children desire sex, to me, that's a perversion. This Professor Dowsett, he was part of the Australian Research Centre in Sex, Health and Society, which produced the Safe Schools program. And the Safe Schools program was marketed as an anti-bullying program, but one of the authors of it is on public record. Somebody videoed it at a Marxist conference. She's a Marxist, where she actually says it wasn't about bullying, it was about getting gender ideology accepted by the younger generation. So you see how dishonest they are in the sense of marketing things, say it's an anti-bullying program, but it's actually to push their agenda into our schools. So there's this whole push to normalise what we might call the whole LGBT view of the world. And interesting is when you look at the gay and lesbian literature, they despised marriage. They were absolutely opposed. As they said, it's an old-fashioned, we should abolish marriage. And yet, a little while later, they actually wanted same-sex marriage. What happened? It was a way of actually trying to normalise and trying to give their same-sex relationships the same status in society as heterosexual marriage. It was, in fact, relatively very few people in same-sex relationships actually end up getting married. Certainly some do, but it was something that they were vehemently opposed to, but they changed their tune, and part of it was this whole thing of the cultural Marxist ideology, because keep in mind that Karl Marx, most of us know he wanted to abolish private property, but that was actually the least problematic thing of what Karl Marx taught. He said we've got to get rid of the church and we've got to get rid of the family. Not many people know that was part of Karl Marx's key. The 3 things was get rid of private property, get rid of family, get rid of church. And you might think, well, how's that going to work if you get rid of family? Well, quite simple. Karl Marx said people should be free to have any kind of sexual relationship with whoever they want to. If a baby's born, hey, you don't have to take responsibility for it. You give it to the state, and the state will bring them up to be good little communists. So that was the line that they pushed. And incidentally, in Russia, after the Russian Revolution, they actually implemented that kind of approach, but within a couple of years, they actually changed it, because if you know anything about a Russian winter, kids cannot survive on the street. There were just so many homeless kids because you could get a divorce for no reason. And so there were so many homeless kids, and people literally had to step over the dead bodies of kids on the footpaths in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And so they decided perhaps it wasn't such a good idea to get rid of family, but that's part of the cultural aspect to try and undermine family. And they couched everything in terms of, and that's part of Marxist philosophy, as you're either oppressed or you're the oppressor. And so LGBT, well, they're the oppressed, and those who oppose their view of the world, well, they're the oppressor. So, if you don't go along with LGBT ideology, well, you're an oppressor, you're a hater, you're an evil person. That's the narrative that very much that comes our way by the media and so on. And so basically what's happened is the Marxist worldview so dominated our education and media and our entertainment, and so it was so much easier for them to sell the LGBT stuff in terms of oppressor and the oppressed. And they cast themselves, the LGBT people, as the oppressed, and anybody who opposed them was part of the nastiness against them. And I'm sure you've encountered this. Anybody who has any objection or voices any objection to the LGBTQ ideology is labelled a bigot or a homophobe or a hater or a hate-filled person. And very few people in our society now are actually willing to stand up and say, hey, this is wrong. When I was in Parliament, there's a couple of times where I spoke up, and some of my fellow parliamentarians would say to me after, geez, Abetz, you were going to say that. I agree with you, but I wouldn't have been going to say it. Why not? Because if you stand against the LGBTQ agenda, the media love to hate you. Just look at the Honourable Nick Goiran, MLC, who's been very vocal about these kinds of issues. The media absolutely detest him. And anything he does has always got to be twisted with as being something sinister or untoward and so on. So people are afraid of losing their position in society if they were to be a voice and speak up. And just in that context, it can be scary because, hey, if you've got a mortgage to pay and kids to feed, you don't want to lose your job. No question about that. But one of the things we've done with the Australian Christian Lobby some years ago, we set up a not-for-profit law firm called Human Rights Law Alliance, and we specialise in religious discrimination cases. Some of you may have seen in the media, for example, Lyle Shelton, who used to be head of ACL, he was dragged before the Queensland, I think it was, Anti-Discrimination Commission for saying that two drag queens with a drag queen story time in a library, that was not, they weren't good role models for kids, words to that effect. It's dragged through the court system for 3 years. He was exonerated, so he's been found not guilty, but the person who lodges the complaint, it doesn't cost them 50 cents, right? They lodge the complaint, but you've got to defend yourself. Well, for Lyle Shelton to have defended himself probably would have cost $250,000. But Human Rights Law Alliance, we took that on pro bono, which means without charging, because we believe these things, we need to push back and make it clear that people can't get away with that. Because if Lyle Shelton had pleaded guilty, then, hey, see, you can't criticise a drag queen story time, and that would set the precedent. So by pushing back, we can try and maintain some of those freedoms. Like we had a case of a TAFE lecturer who'd been at the TAFE for many, many years, and if somebody misused the name of the Lord, he would say, oh, you know him, he's a good friend of mine, referring to Jesus. And that sometimes led to a bit of a conversation, and a woke fellow lecturer reported him to the HR department, and he was called to the HR department, given a letter, threatened with dismissal if ever it would happen again. And he thankfully came to us, and I referred him to the Human Rights Law Alliance, and they dealt with it, and they wrote a legal letter, which only lawyers can do, to the TAFE concerned, and they backpedaled and withdrew the letter instantly, right? But had we not provided that legal support, the HR department would have thought they could get away with that kind of behaviour. So that's why the Human Rights Law Alliance is a really important part of what we do at the an ACL. Okay, and the basically what's happening is that in our society, traditionally we've had a very free society. We've had freedom of speech. You could say what you thought as long as you weren't defaming other people. And that's what we valued and enjoyed in the Western world generally. But what's happened now is we're actually getting a new form of what they call soft totalitarianism, where you are not allowed to disagree with the dominant narrative. If you disagree with the dominant narrative, you're an evil person. And in China, for example, you've got the social credit system. That's perhaps an extreme kind of case, but our system is working very much in the same kind of way. That if you work for Qantas, for example, as a pilot, you have to do a 2-day gender sensitivity training as part of your pilot training. And you're sitting in a flippant cockpit, flying an aeroplane. I'm not quite sure whether what you know about gender stuff is going to make you a better pilot, but most of the pilots think it's loony stuff that they're being told. But one of the pilots told me, he said, we looked at each other, thought, this is all dumb, but they said, look, if we say anything, we're going to be in trouble. So they just button their lips, sit through it all, and off they go. Okay, we've done the training course. But if everybody had actually spoken up who disagreed with what was going on, hey, it could actually have an impact. But of course, the risk is, hey, you might lose your job. And that's the fear. And so it's a very real thing, this soft totalitarianism, but I think we need to learn to have the courage to speak up. So what's actually happened over the time, just in terms of the law changes, since 75 to 94, the gradual repeal of laws criminalising same-sex acts. In 2009, the Federal Parliament changed 85 Commonwealth laws to remove any discrimination between same-sex couples and heterosexual couples. 2013, protections against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity were put into the Sex Discrimination Act at the federal level. And it was then 2017 we had the same-sex marriage thing go through. Now, just in terms of, I thought, just to wake everybody up in the middle of my talk, just tell me if this, is there any cattle people amongst us? Yeah, okay. If that animal there whispered in your ear, I identify as a cow, would you have it on your farm and say, yes, you can be a cow? Now, of course you wouldn't say, that's dumb. But likewise, if that animal on that side, the cow, said, I identify as a bull, it wouldn't be much use to you, would it? The biological reality stares you in the face. And what's important for us is, I think, to actually be game enough to call out scientific reality when people start talking nonsense. But anyway, that was just a little thing to wake you up. Okay. Just in terms of what is it that actually the LGBTQ plus activists claim and believe, the core thing of their belief system is that sex and gender are unrelated. Now that is a scientific nonsense. It simply is untrue. They say gender, gender assigned at birth. Well, I was present at each of our 5 children's birth, and it wasn't the gender assigned at birth. There was a biological reality that I could see with my 2 eyes that determined whether it was a boy or a girl. And to say that doctors somehow randomly decide that it's a boy or a girl, that's total nonsense. It defies reality. The other thing they claim is that sexual orientation is immutable. In other words, you're born gay, or if you're gay and always will be gay. Or if you're trans, you'll always be trans. Well, the fact there is thousands of people in the world who have detransitioned indicates that is actually an outright lie. And James will talk more about that and give you some websites where you can read some of their stories and so on. I've covered the other thing. The other thing is they love false statistics. Hang on, I jumped ahead there. Oops, hang on. Not sure why. Oops. Hang on, now go.
That's it.
Look, next one. Yeah, that's the one I wanted. False statistics. When I was a Member of Parliament, the Equal Opportunity Commission put out a newsletter claiming, if you can see the figure there, that 10 to 21% of students in our schools identify as gay or lesbian. And I thought, what? That's crazy. That can't be right. So I rang a few chaplains that I knew in the school, said, look, just give us an idea, what proportion of kids would you say in your school are gay or lesbian or trans? So about 1 or 2%, everyone, I rang 3 of them, and they all said 1 to 2% is what they thought it was. But where on earth does that 10 to 21% come from? So I got my research officer to do some research on it, contact the Equal Opportunity Commission, said, where do you get this figure from? They said, this research paper published in this and this journal. So we got that from the Parliamentary Library and had a look, and guess where it came from? It was a survey that was advertised on gay and lesbian websites. Well, of course, that's going to give you a very skewed sample, isn't it? But that figure of 10 to 21% is still trotted out on every professional development that teachers do in Western Australia about agenda stuff. It's trotted out all the time. And yet it is not, if you well, at least when I did agricultural science, we had a subject called research and methods. And if you would have done a sample and sent that in as an assignment, you would have got 0%. Because that's not research. That's just simply trying to peddle an ideology. And it's the same with, they claim 1.7% of people are intersex. That's born with, sort of male, female, bit of each kind of thing. Well, the actual figures are about 0.001%, I think it is. So where do they get that figure from? It's fabricated. Okay, now what we need to remember is that laws have consequences because laws reflect the moral values of our society, and the Christian view of sex and gender actually gives a stable environment for the upbringing of children. It's the blessing of lifelong marriage, and it's also consistent with biological reality. So there's positive things that flow to society if we actually follow the biblical teachings and face biological reality. Oops. In 2013, the Sex Discrimination Act was amended, and it broadly prohibits the discrimination in employment, education, privilege of goods and services for certain what they call protected attributes. In other words, a person whose self-identified gender identity, you're not allowed to discriminate against them on that, or their sexual orientation, or their marital or relationship status. Interesting is, you are allowed to continue to discriminate on the basis of a person's religious belief. They didn't include that. And, I guess, when I was younger, the idea that we would ever need a religious discrimination protection kind of legislation in this country never entered my head because, hey, we've always been a very tolerant society. Aussies generally, hey, if that's what you want to believe, good luck to you, mate, just don't bother me with it. You can do what, you can believe what you like. But now we're in a situation where if you believe that, hey, we're after you. That's basically sort of what's happened. And but religion is not covered, and that's why we were working hard trying to get a religious protection. I would have preferred a religious freedom bill rather than a religious discrimination act, because we ought to speak of it in a positive sense, that we actually have religious freedom, rather than saying, well, you religious people are really bad, but we'll give you a few exemptions to the anti-discrimination legislation, which is really what's kind of happening. And in 2013, when they gave those protected attributes, they actually put into that legislation some protections, or not exemptions, I should say, for churches and faith-based schools. And basically, faith-based schools were free to employ staff and enrol students if it's in accordance with the doctrines, tenets, beliefs or teachings of a particular religion or creed, and if you need to do that to avoid injury to the religious sensibilities of adherents of that religion or creed. So it's a bit of a legalese, but I think you get the picture that basically a Christian school can exclusively employ Christian teachers if that's what they want to do. And if somebody, say a teacher who's employed in good faith 5 years down the track ends up saying, I'm leaving my wife, I'm now living with a man, I'm in a same-sex relationship, under the law as it stands at the moment, the school can terminate the services of that teacher. But that is about to change. I was running out of time, I think. The current law in Australia is that broadly it's unlawful to discriminate a person on the grounds of all those things, but churches and faith-based schools, we're provided with these exemptions in discriminating employment on the basis of those attributes. But what's coming is that the Albanese government, they have asked the Australian Law Reform Commission to commissioned a report to how could they do it, pass or change the law so the faith-based schools cannot discriminate against a student or a staff member on the basis of their sexual orientation, gender identity, marital or relationship status or pregnancy. So basically what they're trying to do is they're trying to pull out the right for faith-based schools to give preference in employment to people of the same faith of the school, and also to require staff to live in keeping with the ethos or the moral values that the school stands for. So that is, if that were to go through, it would effectively spell the end of the Christian schools as we know it today. Because basically what they're trying to do is they're trying to force Christian schools to embrace the LGBTQ plus view of the world. And incidentally, there's not only Christian schools, the Muslim schools are equally affected by that, or Jewish schools. I had a bit of fun with this is the federal side, but at the state level, there's also the Equal Opportunity Act, which the state government is reviewing, and they've basically come out with very similar, the Law Reform Commission in WA came out with a very similar kind of report. And I went to see the Attorney General, and I thought, Australian Christian lobby, how much notice they're going to take of us. So I invited the chair of the Islamic Council to come with me, and a retired Jewish rabbi, and also the president of the Australian Federation of Islamic Council, who happens to live in WA, and happened to know him from when I was a member of Parliament. So the four of us went to see the Attorney General, and the Attorney General said, look, I'm prepared to give you, not accept that part of the report that says that you should be able to give preference to people of faith in your school when you employ them, but he wasn't prepared to allow us to terminate the services of a teacher who, say, turns out gay after a while, or says I'm now trans or whatever. And it was interesting, the president of the Australian Federation of Islamic Councils, he looked him in the eye and he said, we would sack such a person, we'd rather go to jail than have him teaching in our schools. And I think that's the kind of attitude that we as Christians also need to take, to say, hey, enough is enough. This we're going to draw a line in the sand as to, we will not bow to a law that actually defies our right to religious freedom and also our right to educate our children according to the values that we want them to go up with. So, there's the examples there. A school could not refuse to consider a person's application for promotion to a leadership position because they're divorced or in a new relationship. A school could not require any staff member to sign a statement of belief by which they had to affirm that homosexual acts are sin. Which, for a Christian school, that's not an unreasonable thing, or for a Muslim school, and yet that would not be permitted any longer. It was interesting, in Sweden, there was a court case that went to the European Court of Human Rights, and they actually ruled against the Swedish government, saying that it's indispensable for pluralism in a democratic society for religious bodies to retain staff who convey the identity of their organisation. And so that's a really good legal precedent that we hopefully will be able to use as well. Just in terms of, in WA this is possibly coming, and at the federal level, but in Victoria it's already happened. They've passed the law that faith-based schools are not allowed to discriminate in employment on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. So that's a real problem. What tends to happen now is that schools no longer advertise their positions, but you kind of use your networks to try and recruit teachers. Northern Territory has done the same. In fact, the Catholic bishop up there has said that if they actually enforce the law, that he would actually close all the Catholic schools. There's no point in having them. And interesting is that faith-based schools in WA save the government between $500 million a year and $1 billion a year. If all of those kids, if all the faith-based schools said, you can have our school buildings, you run these schools, we're bailing, it would cost the government an extra $500 to $1 billion to actually run the schools. So we're actually saving taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars by having our schools. South Australia, they've gone very much down the similar sort of line. In Western Australia, I've mentioned the Equal Opportunity Act. That's the Anti-Discrimination Act in WA, it's called the Equal Opportunity Act. And so I mentioned they've reviewed the Act, and the McGowan government at the time said we broadly accept all those recommendations. That's what I went to see the Attorney General about. And we're expecting the legislation to come into Parliament probably early next year. So we've got to wait and see what's going to happen. And again, just if they're going to implement the recommendations of the Law Reform Commission, it'll actually mean that you can't discriminate in terms of giving preference to religion, a person who shares the faith of the school in phys ed or maths, because that's got nothing to do with religion. They don't understand the whole concept of the Christian world and life view. So that's a real concern. Okay, we've covered that. Interesting is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which Australia signed up to. The states party, that's a quote, the states party to the present covenant undertake to have respect for the liberty of parents to ensure the religious and moral education of their children is in conformity with their own convictions. Australia signed up to that, so it really should require us to have the right to have schools that actually teach the way that we convey the values we want to. The problem in Australia is that governments can sign up to all these international conventions, but they have no force in law unless the federal government actually passes legislation to say this now becomes law in Australia. And because religious freedom, nobody thought that was necessary when they signed up to that, because we have religious freedom. But the need for this to actually be enshrined in legislation is becoming quite significant. So what we need is Christian schools need to be able to continue to employ Christian staff, teach Christian doctrine and maintain a community of faith through their staff codes of conduct and student behaviour policies. That's the argument we've put to the Attorney General. And any reforms to federal discrimination law should clearly state that a religious school is not discriminating when its actions are consistent with its religious beliefs and practices. To say, when we live out our faith, to say you're discriminating, well, hang on a minute, they're discriminating against us by not allowing us to live our Christian life. So, unfortunately, what's happened is that LGBTQ ideology is trumping religious freedom in this country. That's the basic problem. Just very quickly, conversion therapy is another piece of legislation that's coming our way. Back in the 1950s, 60s, psychiatrists and psychologists often used electroconvulsive therapy and ice baths and aversion therapy to try and help people unlearn being gay. Churches didn't engage in that. That was just part of the normal medical scene. In Australia, there have actually been no reports of conversion practices in the last 30 years or so. So you think, why are governments introducing conversion therapy laws? Well, it's quite simple. Before I say it, we'd all agree that it's wrong to have coercive practices trying to force people to change. I think we'd all agree with that. But the LGBTQ activists, they claim that anything that does not affirm them in their view of the world is actually conversion therapy. which is quite a bizarre claim, because basically what it does is, it says we cannot discuss this because our view is right. Anybody who doesn't agree with us is wrong, is immoral, and they're so dangerous they shouldn't be allowed to express their view. And they claim that, because they claim it harms them, but there's actually no supporting evidence for that. But they keep repeating the narrative, the media keep repeating it, and so it takes on a life of its own in the public realm. Queensland, Queensland was the first state to introduce anti-conversion therapy legislation, and they only made it apply to AMA and other professional bodies or medical workers. Pastors and counsellors were not included in that legislation, but that was the first step. And what you find is every time another state introduces, they go a little bit further. So it's limited to registered health professionals, and as I said, pastors and counsellors are not affected. The ACT was the next. They went a little bit further, and theirs actually includes parents. Did you know that in the ACT and also in Victoria, I think that's the next slide, Victoria has the most freedom-destroying legislation and most draconian anti-conversion laws in the country. And basically under their legislation, if your little Johnny comes home from school and says, I want to be a girl from now on, if you do not say, that's wonderful, Johnny, we'll let you do that. If you say, look, Johnny, you're a bit too young to make that decision, you could actually lose your child and have your child taken away from you, because that's now child abuse in Victoria. Would you believe that? I'm not making this up. That's absolutely true. So parents are petrified of saying anything against if their child is going down that path, and often in schools, that the school actually allows the child to transition without the parents' knowledge. When the parents find out and are horrified and say, hang on, he's too young to make that decision, they've got a choice to either go along with it or lose their child. That's the reality. And in Victoria, if after a church service, somebody comes up to you, as a pastor, and says, look, you don't have to be a pastor, just a member of the church. If somebody says, I'm struggling with same-sex attraction, will you please pray for me? If you pray for them and say, dear Lord, please help them overcome this issue of same-sex attraction, I hope and pray that you'll put a person in their path who can help them in this. If that person tells someone else about what's happened, and that person says, I think that prayer harmed this person, the person who prayed can be charged with a criminal offence, up to 10 years prison, and up to $100,000 or $200,000 fine. And if the church as a body endorsed what was going on, and if they have a policy they would pray that way for a church, the church can be fined up to $1 million, and every member of the church board can be fined up to $200,000 as well. For a home invasion, what sort of penalty do you get for that? Can you see it's totally out of proportion, and it's really a very tragic state of affairs. Okay, so what's coming for us? The Attorney General's announced that we will have anti-conversion laws coming. I'm not sure exactly when it's going to be coming, but we don't really know what's going to be the content of it. But again, we expect legislation either late this year or early next year. So we really do face a pretty precarious future in terms of being able to continue to teach the traditional Christian understanding of sexuality and gender. And, back in the year 2000, former Justice Michael Kirby, who was a gay man, he actually said to the Australian-New Zealand Association of Psychiatry, where he was asked to give a speech, he said that anybody who takes the Bible literally, in terms of its teaching on these things, may require psychological or psychiatric attention. So most of us in this room, according to him, require psychiatric attention, simply for believing what the Western world has been teaching for the last 2,000 years. Okay, so what can we do? Taking action is really the critical issue. The most subversive act against the emerging soft totalitarianism is simply to tell the truth. And that's a quote from Rod Dreher in Live Not by Lies. And so speak the truth. Gender is binary. Don't be cowed into silence. And ask questions. If somebody sort of sprouts the gender ideology stuff, if you tackle them head on, their hackles tend to go up. What I found most effective is when they say, "Oh, really? How do you know that is true?" And most of them haven't got a clue. They've kept hearing this thing, but they don't actually know why it's supposedly true. People are born gay. How do you know that's true? They haven't got an answer. Then I come back and say, well, they've actually done identical twin studies, which have conclusively shown that people are not born that way, because if it's a genetic thing, then if one of the identical twins was gay, the other one would have to be as well. And there's only about a 50-60% situation of both of them being that. So it's definitely not genetic. So it's just asking, how do you know it's true, is one of the, it's a polite way of saying, hey, do you really know what you're talking about? And it helps to undermine their confidence in the narrative that's been sprouted for so long. But on the other hand, I think we also need to face the fact we may need to suffer for Christ's sake, for standing for what is right and true. And that brings me to my end of my talk. So I think we're going to have a little break now. Yep. And then it's over to James.